Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Saratoga Whiskey Club tasting number 162. It's been a busy past few weeks. We've had a lot of tastings, which is great. It's kind of how we roll during the summer. And yeah, so we have a special guest with us tonight, Chris Bittner, who was the longtime global brand ambassador for Samaroli, who has now started his own import business, still working with Samaroli and some other really cool brands. Holly and I were talking a little bit ago about the import business and how excited he probably is to be in it, and at the same time, how much of a challenge it can be as well. But we're very excited to have you with us tonight, Chris, and we're really excited to be tasting not just whiskey but rum tonight. We haven't actually had a rum tasting for a little while, so I know some of us are really excited to get back into the rum profile. But yeah, so welcome. I was doing a little research before we started, and when I was kind of really getting into traveling for distilleries and stuff like that, I went to Italy, and Italy is one of those interesting countries that there is pockets of whiskey, but it's still not as popular or as well known as, say, in France or some other countries. But I do remember early on seeing some Samaroli bottlings and understanding and learning about how special that brand and name is, not just from whiskey, but rum as well and other things. But and I didn't realize it went all the way back to 1968. So that's another pretty cool thing. But I'm not going to jump into that. I just was like, wow. So pretty exciting to hear more about that and these whiskeys that are now available for us to taste and also purchase. So yeah, welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for providing the whiskey and rum for this as well, and really excited to hear your story and the story behind these tastings that we're going to have.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was a very lovely introduction and very well said. So I apologize in advance for all all of the sort of like foot and mouth that will subsequently occur while I speak.
Never in
But
mouth and our tastings for sure.
super. Well, as Charles said, I'm Chris. I used to work for Samaroli directly, basically just working with the brand. Did that for almost 2 years. Then I worked for their previous importer. Then COVID happened. They let me go. And so, as I like to say, I sort of built my business out of spite after I was let go at the beginning of COVID. And I also just had too much sort of idle time on my hands dwelling in my apartment in New York, trying to figure out what to make of each day. So I decided that, so the most proper way to spice up my life was to dive headfirst into really uninteresting bureaucracy, and piecemeal together this business. So here we are. So we're trying, Samaroli, which is very near and dear to my heart for obvious reasons, but then also Dead Reckoning, which was my second supplier, who was kind enough to want to do business with me, which I still feel is a sort of graciousness that I'm very, very grateful for. But yeah, it's hard to sort of say or it's hard to sort of speak about if I have some sort of opinion or slant in terms of what my business is. At this point, I really like to be upfront about the fact that I'm working every day like my hair is on fire, and it's running a small business, and there's not a whole lot that's sexy about it, but it is very fun, and the highs are very highs, the lows are unforgiving. So I really appreciate everyone taking their time this evening to hear me yuck about all these things that I care a lot about. So starting with Samaroli, because Charles did a really good job of sort of painting this, or setting the stage rather, for talking about Italy and what it means as far as whiskey is concerned. I think, Charles, you're right. Like contemporarily, you could go to Italy and have no idea that it has any relationship with whiskey, and it's one of the things that fascinates me about it. So in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you had Allied occupation in Italy. So you had American soldiers and British soldiers in the country. And so that was through, pretty typical means, the first proper introduction through soldiers' rations, right? Tobacco's coming in, whiskey's coming in from the Brits, it's Scotch. From the Americans, it's bourbon. And I think to this day, actually, in parts of France, there's it's like Jim Beam is popular in a certain area versus what is another like real low hanging fruit bourbon? Yeah, it'll come to me later. But there's sort of like a dichotomy that's present because there were certain soldiers that were based here, and that's the ration they got, and others elsewhere. So Italy sort of has this fascinating relationship that's born of the war. And there are other examples of this throughout the world that are sort of fascinating. Japanese denim is another one, right? Where Japan was exposed to 501 Levi's because of Allied occupation. So there's a lot of weird, like cool subculture stuff that comes out of like these horrible moments in history. And I kind of find that interesting. And so the Italians are first exposed to it, as I mentioned, through the rations, through the soldiers and Allied occupation. And then after Allied occupation ends, you have the rebuilding of Europe, right? So you have the introduction of the Marshall Plan, massive economic injection into Europe. And Italy is one of the like specific beneficiaries of this plan, and they really run with it. So for the first time in Italy's history, they established like a bona fide middle class, which was sort of non-existent prior to that moment, right? Historically, Italy's sort of aristocratic class, and then mostly an agrarian society, not sort of middle class as we understand it. However, in the industrialization of Italy after the war, a lot of factory jobs, like solid middle class income, and there was this sort of seed of thought among the Italian population that was, I like to reduce it to this at least, is these guys won the war, they drank whiskey, maybe we should drink whiskey. And so that kind of was this nascent thought that propelled the zeitgeist. And then, and so the general population started drinking whiskey, and how that happened was largely due to the upstarts like Silvano Samaroli and a choice few others in Italy, because there was no pre-established distribution channel that was bringing whiskey into the country. So these guys had to sort of go out and be like, hey, what's going on with this whiskey? Looking to buy whiskey, da, da, da. And so some distilleries, some independent bottlers who had stock, people were willing to play ball, but everything was sort of piecemealed, right? Everyone's getting back up on their feet. There are distilleries that hadn't had the ability to lay away stock. So that which they had available to sell was very young, like stuff that otherwise has virtually no market. But the Italians, by virtue of coming into the situation with just sort of a hunger, a demand, and no greater expectation, no greater sort of conception of age statements and all the rest, it created this really interesting moment where whiskey was approached with kind of a blank slate by people who really, really care about how things taste and have a long, illustrious history of caring about those things, but didn't really care about any of the other bells and whistles that were associated with the spirit. So consequently, things like very famously Glen Grant, to this day produces an expression that's Glen Grant 5-year, which is produced exclusively for the Italian market. And that was born of this moment where Glen Grant didn't have enough stock laying around to sell them something that was 10, 12, 15, what have you. But they had some 5-year-old whiskey and some young whiskey, so they'll pump that out. And the Italians were like, yeah, great, it's whiskey, done, cash in hand. Same is true of a lot of these other very famous and now heralded bottlings from places like Macallan, like really off year marks. Like there's a Macallan 7-year that was really popular in Italy, and that's sort of this heralded, highly valued bottling in the auction market now. And so this is a bunch of information to say that Italy in no small part played a pretty tremendous role in globalizing whiskey, I'd argue, right? Especially single malt. Prior to that moment, obviously, like the big blends, the stuff that I would associate with my grandparents' generation, the Chivas, the Johnny Walkers, like those things are flowing around the world with relative frequency. But single malt was otherwise sort of a heralded domestic product. And because that was what was made available to these smaller Italian importers, that is what started coming over into Italy. And so Silvano is one of these upstarts and one of these entrepreneurs. He was an importer for several years prior and was just importing wine and champagne, sort of small scale business. He obviously caught the same sort of excited bug that everyone else did, and he got very lucky and grabbed a very beautiful linkwood. And by virtue of that alone, everyone sort of encouraged him, yeah, you should totally do this again. And he became very passionate about the pursuit and sort of abandoned the rest of his importing and dedicated himself wholly to the import of whiskey. Because there was no pre-established distribution channel and everything was sort of piecemealed, as I've described, there are a lot of funny sort of relics of that time where people were like hand labeling everything. So it wasn't like the standardized labels that you see today. So if you look back at these old whiskey bottlings, these gorgeous sort of like hand painted bespoke projects. And that's born specifically because sometimes the stock was purchased not from the distillery, but from an independent bottler. But they had to find some way to market it and make it kosher within the Italian framework. And so then that's what they did. Everything was kind of very ragtag, which obviously is a small business I relate to heavily. But even outside of this, when I was just learning about this to begin with, I just kind of thought it was fascinating because it was people just doing people things, and that was cool. So Silvano,
a
sorry,
quick question on that.
yeah.
So when he was first, like, say, for example, that Linkwood barrel,
Mm-hmm.
was that bottled in Scotland and then but not labeled, and then somehow he got his hands on those bottles, or was that actually bottled for him in Scotland with his label and all of that? Or you know what I mean?
So yeah. So that bottling, as far as I understand, it was bottled in Scotland, but he had to sort of supply the artwork and all the various sort of
So
Italian registration, right?
standard method then, yeah.
Yeah. Granted, it says like all of his information. He was importing into Brescia at that point, so it's all of that. But there wasn't like the Scots were not necessarily like, hey, we're going to do all this for you. You're not buying like a tremendous amount of quantity.
Right.
So he, among others, had to supply probably quite a bit in the way of dry goods that or now presently rather, people wouldn't, or would be sort of atypical. We're also talking about this is the late 50s, early 60s. This is before he formally became an independent bottler, because there's the Linkwood, which was the first one. And then after that, and he received some sort of affirmation in the Italian market, then he went back and he made a solid relationship with Cadenhead. And so Cadenhead, very famous Scotch independent bottler. And so there's the whole series, which is now referred to in the auction market as the dumpy bottlings, because he used Cadenhead's dry goods. And so then grabbed those, has his own bespoke labeling, but it is literally the Cadenhead glass. And then from there, everything sort of like escalates, rolls into another thing. And eventually in 68, or I would imagine a little bit before then, he decides to formally become an independent bottler. So if you ever see on the bottles themselves, they'll say bottled by Coylton International Limited. That is the shell company identity that he came up with because he was very paranoid that if they found out he was Italian, they would kick him out and they wouldn't let him do business there, because he is the first non-British, non-Scottish independent bottler in history. So that's why I said, as I said before, when we think about whiskey as this global commodity, specifically single malt, Silvano plays a really, really large part in that history and opening it up. And now, obviously, we live in a world where there are independent bottlers from all over, and he plays a very significant role in that transition culturally. So formalizes the company in 68. And at that point, as I said before, he abandons everything else in terms of his import business and focuses entirely on single malt. Then going into the 70s and the 80s, he's a big pioneer of cask strength, which at that point was not in vogue in the market. And he was kind of the first, arguably, to be doing that in a meaningful way. And so a lot of his older bottlings, you'll see like natural strength. Strength is misspelled oftentimes because of language barrier. And for some odd reason, a lot of times they felt the impulse, which they still do today, to use English when I feel like they should have used Italian, but they saw it as sort of something that was chic and vogue, and that was something that they liked about whiskey. So I sort of understand it more in that sense.
Chris, quick question about I think you're still there. Is he frozen or is it just me?
He's frozen.
Um,
Oh, he's back. This is not
Did I
about
lose
the
you?
brand. But I find it so interesting that countries kind of get lumped into flavor profiles. Is that still, would you say that the Italian market, that's their flavor profile that they like, is young and bright Scotch, or is it just because that's all they had and maybe that's changing? Like you'll hear, oh, Germany's for sherry, matured whiskey,
Yep.
North America, they'll drink anything. Like it kind of gets divvied up of who drinks what. Is that the flavor profile that the Italians like, or that's just what they were offered for so long?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I have the absolute correct answer to it. I have like the Samaroli world propaganda answer to it, but they kind of have an appreciation of a lot. I think, they love a classic space side profile. They're less wrapped up in, and this might come down to sort of marketing, but they're less wrapped up in the sort of fetishistic idolization of certain distilleries. Like they recognize the importance of distilleries, of course, just as you would like a great winery, right? Um, it's important to acknowledge that history, but there are a lot of distilleries that were popular in Italy that here, for example, by way of comparison, are less popular. And they think that they're like tremendous and they're really indicative of a region's profile. But through them and the vessel of Samaroli, I would say that they love Speyside, they love Isla for what it is, they love Campbelltown, but perhaps they're less sort of preoccupied about a specific region being better than the rest. But I don't know. On some level, maybe one could argue that Speyside is sort of preeminent in the world. But it's a good question, and I'm sorry that my answer is probably not on the
No,
money
it's
here.
okay because we talked a bit about it, but just from like overarching at Bacardi, Italy was where you put bourbon matured young whiskey. So when you said that,
Oh,
that's where the Devon, they pulled it out of the US market because they're like, oh, Italy, Italy will drink it. So
yeah. It's
it
so
was
it's
just,
it's it's funny you say that too, because the one of the whiskeys that we'll try, the Apprentice, is a vatting
oh
of
yeah,
three
McDuff.
casks from Macduff. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Macduff in
Actually,
Italy.
that's a good segue to our first whiskey because that is our
Is that
first
the
whiskey.
first one?
Yes.
We
So
should wet
that
our whistle a little bit.
yes, definitely. If you haven't been, just because I've been yucking it up here, my apologies. I hope everyone has just jumped the gun.
Oh, no, we're good.
um, the Apprentice is a vatting of three casks from Macduff. The distillate's all from 2017. And so like we're sort of touching on here, it is emblematic of that younger style of whiskey. And from what I understand, with the A series, the Apprentice, the Ardenistle, and the Architectus, each one has a sort of different blending project and a conceit behind it. And the Apprentice is intended to be emblematic of that young, fresh style of whiskey that was very popular in Italy in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But now, other than like Glen Grant 5 Year, which is still produced, Glen Grant's owned by Campari now. It's sort of a lost art. I think a lot of the Italian whiskey market has been relegated to a subculture. People who remember this time and or are sort of independently interested in it. But it's cool. It's not something that you see typically in the US. I quite like it. It's a fun approach to Scotch in general. I think it's not overly serious, and it's something that most distilleries are not necessarily going out of their way to demonstrate, and yet it's sort of a beautiful example of the distillate in a pretty raw form.
So this one's 43% ABV. So you said three different casks from the Macduff.
Yep, all 2017.
Okay.
So that put them at about 6 years old at bottling.
Yep. Definitely has that light fruity quality to it. I'm getting a lot of like apple on this one as well, and fresh, kind of bright.
Yeah, melon, that
Yeah,
kind of
melons.
what's that? Honeydew.
Little
Yeah.
tropical melon in there.
Chris, is this just in the US market, this release, or is this a larger
No,
blend
so
from?
this is a global release. One of the few things that came out of COVID that was sort of convenient for everyone's interest was that 700 mLs were finally going to be allowed in the US, which previously Samaroli had to bottle separately 750 mLs for the US market, which made everything costlier and like more cumbersome. So this is something that is released globally.
Very herbal nose, like smells like my garden, rosemary, thyme, and mint.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, it's it's herbal, it's fresh. Like Holly was saying, sort of honeydew, green apple. You still get a little bit of that kind of, nice bready, battery kind of quality that's very indicative of Speyside, but it's not so sort of matured and fully realized. It's just like a hint of it there.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
like that vanilla cupcake batter.
can't some McDuffs have a little bit of a kind of a funk to them? I'm not getting any of that on this, really.
Yeah, they definitely can, and I've had some that possess that. There's one bottling I had in Singapore. It was a 70s bottling of Macduff, and it was a real big funk bomb, and it was like a totally different expression of the distillate than I had ever had. But Samaroli, I think this is really indicative of the Samaroli approach, right? Where they really, really value elegance and finesse. So some of the like bigger, more brooding characteristics and kind of like funky bottlings, they tend to eschew. But then when they do come to them, they're delightful because it is like it's an anomaly in terms of their style. But I think that if you were to draw a through line between all of their whiskey projects, regardless of the region, and then also the rum and cognac and Armagnac by extension, like there's this sort of like elegance as a priority throughout all the spirits they bottle.
Yeah, I would never have guessed that this is a McDuff just based on tasting it. But it's really nice. It's definitely a great summertime sipper for sure.
Oh, big time. Yeah, if there's a porch crusher of a scotch, this is it.
Yeah. And I'm everybody goes through this kind of wave or graph of their whiskey exploration journey, whatever you want to call it. And there is a point where you start to go up in the graph and everything has to be cask strength and single cask and all of this fanfare with all of that, and there's nothing wrong with that, and it is great, and you do get a lot of really beautiful flavors. But what happens is you forget about all the other stuff that you've kind of left in the dust, or you need to come back to, that actually is at a certain percentage for a reason as well, or a blend, Compass Spot, all of these different whiskeys, right? So it's kind of refreshing to go back and especially started tasting like we are, with some of these lower proof bottling, so that our palates aren't used to something already that's too strong and not going to let us allow us to taste it. Or I don't know, it's kind of fun.
Definitely, and I appreciate you saying that, because trust me, I eat a lot of shit for the fact that Samaroli proofs down. But it's as I like to tell people, it's not. It doesn't come from a cynical place. If anything, it comes from a really overly romantic place. Silvano Samaroli himself passed away in 2017, and he didn't have anyone familially to hand the company down to. So he was kind of faced with this existential question of, as he got older, like, does the company die with me, or do I pass it on to someone that will maintain my philosophy and maintain my vision? And so the latter is ultimately what he elected to do. And so he sold it to a man named Anacleto Bleve, who was a really important private client of his in Rome, who was an entrepreneur in his own right, just albeit a restaurateur. And so he was a really early adopter of Samaroli. He was the first person to buy a private label from Samaroli, which I'll touch on again at another one of these bottlings. But so Anacleto decided to buy the company, and with the condition that his son Antonio would become Samaroli's apprentice. And so goes the namesake of this bottling. And so Antonio sort of had it is at once like a wonderful thing to inherit this company, but then it's also kind of a burden because it's really difficult to be the following act to Jesus Christ within this whiskey world. And he does a lot to honor Silvano's legacy. So like bottling at 45, which I know this is 43, but we'll see with many Samaroli bottlings that 45 is often their like go-to proofing. And that is just, it's simply because Silvano, who some of his earliest casks that I'd mentioned, he sourced from Cadenhead, and Cadenhead's go-to proofing is 46. And so he said, okay, Cadenhead is fantastic.
Oops. Got caught in the
Right. So, sorry, say again?
No, you froze again just for a second.
Sorry, Maine is trying to do its damnedest to keep me.
It's all good. It was just for literally a second. You said Cadenhead's was the best, and they were at 46. So
Silvano was of this opinion. He adored Cadenhead and really respected them, but because they proved at 46, he elected to prove at 45.
Yeah.
And there's no sort of great intellectual thought beyond that. And so to this day, when you see Samaroli bottling at 45 or 90 proof, that is a big contributing factor. But then secondarily, as Silvano got older, as I mentioned before, he was a big pioneer cask strength, right? And as he saw the whiskey industry change and sort of multinational money come in, the industrialization of Scotch more broadly, he felt that it was really important for him to demonstrate his prowess as a selector. So no longer was it sort of fast and easy just to take a cask, bottle it as is, and be on his way, but rather to demonstrate to his clients, like, no, I chose this cask specifically, and I'm not going to hide any quality about it, because with high alcohol, you can obviously hide flaw in spirit. So he elected to proof it in this sort of like naked, very revealing selection process, which is fascinating to me because makes my life harder, makes their lives harder. There's nothing that's necessarily like easy market appeal about it, but it's kind of what makes them fun, and it kind of it maintains their sort of like punk rock origins and keeps true to all that, which I quite like.
that's cool. Well, speaking of 45, so we're gonna do the blend next.
Yes.
So the first one was a blended malt. So 3 casks of Macduff. Now we're moving to a blended Scotch. So malt and grain.
Yes.
And then after this, we're going to be back with blended malt, but it's got some peat, so that's why we put it last. So we're doing the Architectus now, which is 45% ABV. And what's the story behind this one?
So the Architectus is one of these blending projects that Samaroli became really fascinated by as he got on in his years, where, as I mentioned before, he started proofing down, but then also with his general cynicism regarding the quality of single casks that were less and less available as he got older. He felt that blending was this really essential art that he needed to pursue that channel in order to honor the spirit and also honor his own legacy. So blending projects became sort of his fascination. He continued to do single casks when he felt it was appropriate, but in this instance in particular, he was very intrigued by how the bigger named Scotch houses, if you will, all the mainstream product is, or largely, a blend of grain and malt. And so he looked at that as this sort of the top of the pyramid, something to pursue. So he had a blending project in the late 80s that he started, and then it went through many different iterations, different names, and all the rest. But this is now intended to be sort of the pillar that honors that history, where he's finding some harmony between grain and malt. So this one specifically is 2012 North British from the Lowlands and 2017 Tom and Tool.
That's like soft on soft. Was it Tall is the what's their slogan? The gentle dram.
Yeah, I
Which
mean,
always
from a taste profile, this one's softer than the first one,
mm,
even though it's a little bit higher proof.
Hmm.
But definitely, it's
I like
got
this
a
one.
soft quality to it.
Yeah, and again, a nice sort of like stepping stone, I think, into immersing yourself in understanding like what is the Samaroli approach. Like it's not it, as someone said to me pretty recently, like they don't know anyone else that's able to capture as much flavor and like finesse at this proof than Samaroli. And I found that that was like a really beautiful compliment because it is something that they're quite astute with. Um, but yeah, elegance all day. If you like a big brooding sucker, then you know I'm open minded. Samaroli doesn't have to be for everyone, but I do find that this is really like this is a nice harmony between the two. It's cool also to see the second iteration of it after seeing the first last year.
What do you suspect with barrel types for this? Because you know there's a little bit of red fruit that comes through. So is there, you know, I know North British with their grain. Um, is it the Tawmy tool where we maybe are getting a little bit of kind of other barrel types or not? Or
I think if I remember correctly, there may I think it's going to be an ex bourbon
right?
and but not like a first fill, and there may be an ex sherry, but
Just,
again not a first fill.
just
Like yeah, it's more like unless it's otherwise noted, it's really just about like the vessel's capacity.
yeah.
And also Samaroli typically is not looking for crazy barrel finishes. They're looking for something that is extremely neutral. Um, so sometimes it's like in terms of the information that I have to then use and convey, it's more about understanding like what is that barrel's capacity? How old is the spirit? Like what is that aging process like? Um, and rather than what is the barrel and how is that going to specifically impart flavor?
And the grain that North British is using, is it most likely corn?
Good question. I would be lying if I said I knew. That is a blind spot for me. North British is this is the first time I've had a North British from Samaroli, period. Um, but
I mean, I know we've had some in the past with other bottlers, and it does have a very sweet kind of note to it.
mhm.
You know, it reminds me of not bourbon, obviously, because of the charred oak, but you definitely get some of that sweetness from corn, maybe a corn whiskey, not in a new charred barrel, but um, I don't know. I could be just whatever. Making
No, I think you could be right on the money. And shame on me for not knowing.
so this is the second iteration you said of this.
Of the A series. So they started this project
Oh,
last year.
okay, got it.
Yeah. So there was the Apprentice from last year, the Architectus from last year, and the Ardenistle.
Anybody have any comments besides Vinny's tasting notes and Holly? Um,
I
Vinny's
like this one.
the dried fruits, the nuttiness, almonds. I like the almonds. I get a little bit of that too. Um, little brine, interesting. Um, lemon, vanilla wafer cookie. Yep, yep.
What's another, is the top market for Samaroli Italy?
Um,
Or where else is it popular? I mean, I know it's been I haven't followed it super close, but I know it's kind of been in and not in and out, but in the States, but at different capacities over the years. Where else is it popular?
a lot. So it varies kind of by the tier, if you will. So a lot of like the really high end stuff was massively popular in Japan, but then like they didn't really care to, this might have been sort of like an importer's decision, I don't know, but they didn't really care to mess around with anything that was more approachable in terms of like price point and offering and youth. But they like anything that was older, higher price tag, that like really specifically went to Japan. The US, as you described, has been very like up and down. Samaroli originally came to the market with Domain Select, which is a company that no longer exists and has a really like shady dark history. But then they were with a wine importer previously, and then now they are with this guy. So they have definitely had a wild ride in the US. In terms of like other like broadly in Europe, I mean France is definitely an important market. Italy has a lot of like sort of like legacy clients, but Italy at large I think is not, it's not what it used to be, right? Like so a lot of the younger demographic, they don't care. So it is really relegated to a nichier world. There's a bit of presence growing in South America, also growing in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong has for a long time been a really solid import partner. And then yeah, it's really scattershot throughout Europe.
Where does the name Architectus come from?
It comes from Antonio's funny, like did a lot of LSD and has a lot of big ideas kind of brain. But he had, I think this is just because I know the man very well and I adore him, but I think he had two of the A's down and then he was like struggling for the last one. So decided to sort of honor the Latin root of architect, which is good in terms of like blending, right? Okay. And I think that's kind of like the conceit behind the grain and the malt. Because that was Silvano's original intent, was to kind of demonstrate what was beautiful about grain.
Labels are beautiful.
Yeah, the labels are again, psychedelic history right there. Is the labels have definitely throughout history have always been sort of standalone.
Is that the Harry Potter train on that one?
It feels like it, yes.
Got a Harry coup on this one, the last one.
Yes.
A Harry water and a castle. That's like straight out of a Pink Floyd album right there.
Yes, and I love that you mentioned that because Antonio is a massive Pink Floyd fan. Pink Floyd very famously had a concert, I think it was at the Coliseum in '68. And he was born in the '70s and sort of like lived in the aftermath of that. Like if he were here, he would talk probably for the next hour about how much he loves Pink Floyd and how much it has influenced a lot of these decisions. So good catch.
Nice. So the last one is the another blended malt. This one's at 50% ABV, so we're climbing.
Mm-hmm.
This one is, and how do you say this? Ardenistle?
Ardenistle.
Ardenistle.
Yes. Okay. So I mentioned before Anacleto Bleve and the first soliciting of a private cask, and that was his doing, and this was actually the name of that project.
Oh, okay.
So this is Antonio sort of honoring his father's legacy and also Silvano's and specifically their relationship. So Ardenistle, if you ask him, he attests that it was absolutely the name of a defunct distillery. However, if you ask his best friend Daniele, who I tend to trust a little bit more in terms of what is actually real, he says, "Chris is made up, is fiction." And so I'm like, okay, gotcha. So so I prefer that history, and I think it's something that to a couple of Italian guys sounded really bona fide Scottish, and so that's what they went with.
And so this has got kind of a Highland barbecue kind of peated smoke vibe going on here. What's
so the original
behind this one?
So the original Ardenistle included Isla distillate. If not included, it may have actually been entirely Isla distillate. But the Ardenistle is meant to demonstrate that, right? Like a beautiful Isla profile. Last year, I believe the blend was Kalila and Jura. What's really fascinating to me about this one is that it, from a sort of blending prowess perspective, it actually has no Isla in it. It's all Highland malt.
Okay.
So this is Inkfad, Inkmuren, and Ardmore.
Okay.
So two expressions from Loch Lomond and Ardmore, which is I think is really cool because if you were to blind me on this and tell me, okay, it's somewhere like a 10 to 13-year-old Caligula in neutral oak, I'd be like, okay, yeah, buy that. It's got sort of the right characteristics there. But again, like looking at blending as an art and appreciating it for that, to be able to compose that which is like feels to me like a very Isla profile, albeit not using any Isla distillate, is interesting and compelling.
Yeah, you're not getting a lot of the kind of seashell seaweed qualities with this. I don't know. I'm getting a lot more just kind of not floral by any means, but there's the brininess is not as present, I guess.
Definitely, and there's also when Samaroli does bottle a lot of their Isla scotches, there's a bit of nostalgia to account for. So as they will attest, the Isla malts of the 60s and 70s and 80s all had a profile that was much more fruit forward and was less sort of singular in its approach. And then they will vouch for the fact that, okay, no, we really, really remember when Scotch from Isla tasted like this, and it was a bit more dynamic. Now, obviously, you know, the profile is known more globally to be leaning into that which we think of as Isla. But if you ever have the opportunity to taste sort of vintage bottlings of, I don't know, like Lefroy from the 70s, it is like sneaky fruit bomb. Has a lot of like the characteristics of Isla that you would come to expect, but all of that sort of fruit forward component that you just highlighted is sort of very purposeful in its execution.
It's almost like they've added iodine in the later years to make it Isla in a way.
Old smoke. It does have which could be either location, Pete, but an ashy, the middle end of the palate is a little ashy peat to me, which could come. I get that in Islas and Thailand peats, even like a Lecheg, that kind of ashy soot sort of thing. Definitely not the medicinal, but I could be tricked on this one. Not on the nose. The nose is sweet. Has that sweeter peat.
I get that ashiness with Glenturret sometimes.
Mhm.
You know, it's kind of this.
Yeah.
On
Wonder
that,
if that's coming from the barrel too. I don't know, because sometimes you can get soot qualities just from the oak with peat, but
yeah.
so
no,
this is it was what, the Loch Lomond and Ardmore, the peated Loch Lomans, I think he said.
he
Let me
wrote-
make a note of it.
Yeah, he said it was Inchmarin, Inchfad.
Oh,
and-
so the unpeated and the peated from
Yeah.
Loch Lomond, and then the Ardmore. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
I think there he is. Be back.
Sorry about that.
You're all good. We were just all taking a bet on how large the lobster roll was that's sitting in front. I'm just joking.
No, I'm just dealing with like Italian quality Wi-Fi, which feels appropriate for the conversation.
So of
Well, now that-
of these three, which is the kind of the most popular or the one that people gravitate towards in general? I mean, I know smoky can be a turnoff for some people, so I'm assuming it's probably one of the first two, right?
So what's fascinating to me is that they really all find their own homes. So
Okay.
Apprentice has some diehards. I'd say Architectus is probably the most polarizing of the three, where either people are just like, nah, not interested, or they're super interested. And then Ardenistle, yeah, it kind of has that fate of what's your relationship to peat. It does create a few converts, I think, by virtue of the fact that it is a sweeter, more delicate administration of peat. So that's always fun. But yeah, it's if I knew or I had rhyme or reason with Samaroli, this would be a much easier and seamless undertaking. But sometimes I sort of just throw it up to like, all right, I'll throw me all the SKUs, and what the one joy about it is, like, I think most of them will find a fan base, right?
So let me ask a question before we move on to rum about Samaroli. As far as my experience with Samaroli has been, which hasn't been much, mostly because of just how exclusive it can become, was the last, say, 10 years, decade before this series came out last year. It was kind of tailored more for collectors, wasn't it? I mean, it truly was like special. I mean, from a price point, quite expensive whiskey. Not that that wasn't deserving or anything like that, but it truly, to me, felt like, oh, Samaroli, that's meant for like special people, or people who had unlimited funds that could afford it. I'm not putting it in the same world as, say, Macallan or any of the other Rolls-Royce brands that we kind of get to know, but it truly had this feeling of being, unique and special, but expensive. Are they trying to like change that image, or, I know, like, so we've gotten to know the folks over at Ardenistle pretty well, and Adelphi also had that kind of same feel, right? I mean, a lot of them were really, really great bottlings, but some of them were just like really expensive. And to me, it was kind of that same world of like, oh yeah, we only have so many releases, and because of that, we can demand a higher price point. Occasionally you see that with Blackadder as well. But I'm just trying to understand, like, is Samaroli trying to like rebrand itself or be more approachable, I guess, in this climate where whiskey is going through its different waves, or whatever you want to call it? I just remember like special Samarolis, and if you were able to taste the Samaroli, you were lucky, or something like that. So I'm just trying to understand like the vision for the future of Samaroli.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is manifold. I think that at once, like Samaroli, if you look at it throughout its history, it's constantly kind of grappling with itself and with what Scotch is and what it thinks it should be. And then at a certain point, once it was solidified that the company would continue to exist, then there was like, okay, like, what do we do with this success and this knowingness? And like, I like to approach it like any sort of a great artist that goes through many different iterations of what they produce. And so I think there's constantly this like internal kind of agonizing over how they should be, what they should be doing, what they should be focusing on. And a lot of times it really is internal. It's not so much to do with like the market at large. As I said before, like if they really concern themselves with the market at large, my life would be a lot easier. But it's not. It's like really like what their creative footprint is going to be, and like how they continue to push themselves and through what means, especially in an industry that becomes increasingly saturated and competitive. In terms of its price, yeah, I know very well that like Samaroli used to be just, for the few. I mean, on some level, one could argue it still is. But I always felt that, especially as a consumer that could not afford it, like there was something I always wanted to be able to make it more accessible, because I know very well how emotional a product it is, right? Like I see that experience with people. I'm always delighted by that. So I have allowed that feeling to become pervasive into my business model, and I'm much more aggressive than a standard importer would be with it. And I think that was part of the problem in the past, is that there's a lot of cynicism with the alcohol industry and how it works. Where it's just kind of like a machine, like something comes in, these are the points that are slapped on, these are the points that are slapped on, moving on. So I'm benefited by being a little ragtag one person operation, and I sort of I cut margin here, I cut margin there, and try and get something into the market that I feel is the most competitive and the most compelling. Given limitations, I can't just go out of business immediately, or so we hope. But they still have bottlings that are extraordinarily expensive, right? Like there is, and I think that at present, rather than focusing on maybe something that is more closely related in terms of like their approach, their price point, all the rest, like I think they're doing a better job of diversifying and sort of trying to create a bridge into the rest of the world. Because they still recognize that a lot of their bottles that have been sold in the past are still, squirreled away somewhere, and they don't want those to be relegated to just the collectors of the world, but rather celebrated and enjoyed by all. But there has to become some sort of vehicle and vessel to create that inquiry and to create that curiosity. Yeah. So that is what I appreciate about this A series, despite the fact that like expensive blends are a real pain in my ass. But
well, they're very tasty, so that helps a lot. I mean,
yeah.
And they have the name recognition and they have the good story. So, I can see it's going to take a little bit of time, but it'll get there. It's wonderful that we're able to taste these and have them in the shop and be able to taste people on them as well. So we'll do our best to help you grow your importing business. But
thank you.
All right, we're going to move on. I know both Chris and I have been rambling way too much. It's almost 8 o'clock and we haven't even touched the rum yet. So let's go ahead and jump into Dead Reckoning. And we're going to start. And again, I don't know if this is the right order, Chris, you tell me, but I was going to start with the Australia and then do the 10.5 and then do the 9.5.
Perfect.
That work?
Yeah, you can flip the 9.5 and 10.5 if you want, but really dealer's choice. I try to not be a fascist about it. Right. We already did whiskey before rum, so we're in good order here. So
we're going to do the Dead Reckoning 9-year Australia bourbon cask rum. So why don't you let us know a little bit about what Dead Reckoning is and what the name is and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, so thankfully, Dead Reckoning has a far less convoluted and illustrious history. It's more of a recent upstart, so I don't have to delve into all of this historical garble. But Justin's awesome. He's a contemporary independent bottler. He's the first independent bottler from Australia, and he is very, as I like to say, he's like rags to rum kind of narrative, right? When he was a young man, was working in coal mines in Australia and just digging in a ditch thinking like, all right, there has to be more to life than this. And then he had some friends that were working in the south of France, like working for like various like mucky mucks who had yachts and all the rest. Come over here. It's awesome. It's easy work. You'll get a job. Don't worry about it. So with reckless abandon, he was like, okay, great. This sounds like it beats digging in a ditch. I'm going to go do that. So eventually he has this funny sort of like high stakes pool game with a guy where the wager was if Justin won, the guy would employ him on the boat. He won that game, and so started his career yachting and being I don't know, what is the correct terminology? I don't know. He's a guy on a boat doing some work. And so he started that, and then he worked for real people that won't even exist within 50 yards of me, Russian oligarchs, like oil sheiks, all the rest, like real characters, insane stories from it. But that basically through yachting and being a boat hand, that's how he ended up going to the Caribbean for the first time. And so that was his exposure to rum, right? Like, so a lot of time that you spent on land, you're in the Caribbean, like, as he learned culturally, like, we're going to go to the bar and drink rum. Like, that's what's going down right now. And so he kind of fell in love with that whole process. And by virtue of that, just put himself through what he felt was his own self-imposed rum university. And when he decided, okay, I'm getting a little old for this whole like lifestyle, what am I going to do here? At that point, he developed quite a palate for rum and an affinity for it. And so in Australia, the rum market was horrible. They just had like Bundaberg and basically Bundaberg. And so he was like, all right, maybe that would be good. So he started his own kind of boutique operation over there. And it was something that like I empathize with a lot because he's a one-person operation. In Australia, actually, if you think the US market's punishing for alcohol, like there, the taxation is horrendous. And so he managed to put together like a really compelling offering focusing specifically on rum, a couple other spirits, of course, but did that for almost a little bit over a decade, and then decided to start bottling himself just by virtue of having created a lot of good relationships in the industry. And the name Dead Reckoning comes from, it's a sailing or like a navigation term. So if you're without proper like GPS and you're in, I don't know, a storm or some like hardcore fog, if you're over radio and someone tells you, all right, like you got to go 30 degrees southwest, then you're dead reckoning your direction. You're dead reckoning your navigation. But I didn't know that prior to talking to him. I just thought that was a fucking great name. And I was sold on that. And the fact that he wanted to work with me because he was my second supplier at that point.
Cool. Well, as a shop, we're getting more into single cask rum. So this is really fun to try a new brand, new bottler. So this is Australian rum. We've had, I think, one. What was the was it Beanley?
Beanley. Yeah. So
before.
Yep.
Is that what this is, or
that is Beanley? And unfortunately, Beanley, by virtue of being an Australian company and Justin being an Australian bottler, they wouldn't sell to him directly. Okay. For like sort of like conflict of interest, what have you. But they did make him wise to the fact that he could purchase some Beanley rum from the very famous broker in the Netherlands, E.A. Schier. So that's what he did. And so this bottling is, I think it's cool. It was very like specifically chosen. He felt, especially when he started, it was important to represent Beanley just in light of its history to Australia and all the rest. And he wanted to source some of their juice for a blending project that he had. But it was a sort of like, it was a good I have arrived bottling. But it deviates from the rest of what he does. And in that now, what he's typically doing is he's taking casks back to where he is in Adelaide and recasking and putting everything through a secondary maturation, a process that he has termed Australian dry aging, because Adelaide has one of the lowest humidity points in the world, but it has really punishingly hot, like sort of desertous summers. So you have a really interesting relationship, obviously, by virtue of the climate, the cask, and the spirit as it's aging. But that doesn't apply to this one. It will apply to the next two.
So,
but here,
right. So the first 4 years is tropical aged where exactly?
In Australia.
In Australia, okay. And then it's on land, on the mainland for 5 years.
Correct. Yeah. Then it's in the Netherlands.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So tropical aging, as far as the bottling is concerned, tropical is just going to apply to wherever the sugarcane itself is being cultivated.
Well, it says on the side, it says it's molasses. This one's molasses. Yep. So it's not sugarcane, this one, right?
Not sugarcane juice, but in terms of like the actual production, like the crop being harvested and processed and then aged subsequently, that's what the tropical aging is referring to, is its time spent at Beanley.
Okay, got it. And 40% angel share. That's quite amazing.
Yeah.
That's just during the tropical aging, or?
I mean, I would imagine the bulk of it there, and then the rest of it, like Queensland is not terribly far off in terms of like how it's going to. The aging process is different, but yeah, it's not going to undergo the same sort of rapid loss that you would have, in the Netherlands, which is going to be comparatively a bit more gradual.
Well, it's got a lot of different flavors going on with this one for sure. I'm even on this like fourth or fifth sip now on the nose. I'm getting like a little gunpowder. Like just...
yeah, it's one of these rums that I actually have had to like sort of. I just realized I'm getting very dark here. I need to find a light. but yeah, it's one of these distillates, like not just that bottling, that I sort of initially struggled to enjoy because as far as rum is concerned, I really like overly funky, nasty, very forward-facing rums, if you will. And it is not that, which is oh, there we go. All right, we're in business. Sorry, I'm over at my I'm at the cottage where my mother is staying, so that I spare everyone of all the chaos that I had mentioned. Um,
All good.
yeah, the Beanley is one of these things that's like I love so many characteristics of it, but it's just not distillate that I'm otherwise or I have been immediately drawn to. But this bottling really like changed. It was part of the evolution of things. It was something that initially I tried this and the other bottling that he had proposed to me, and this was the one that gave me the most sort of pause. But then as I revisited and then revisited and revisited, the thing that kept coming to mind was that it was a different experience every time, and I took away from that like, okay, maybe I'm not immediately falling head over heels with it, but it's something that bears a lot of complexity, and anything that's going to change every time you revisit it is something that I think is inherently compelling. Like
Oh, totally.
sometimes it's like a big peach bomb, sometimes it's like weirdly like blue cheesy. You mentioned like gunpowder. It's got like this kind of austerity that I find really interesting. The mouth on it, it's like very, very giving and full.
But it's not and again, we are not rum experts. We're at the middle beginning of our journey for sure, and we come at it from such a whiskey perspective. But what are the kind of ester levels? Like, it's not your funky Jamaican rum, or I mean, there's a ton going on, but it's not that overbearing explosion of your senses. Like, it's not delicate, but I called it kind of like, I find Australian rum to be cute, like in this very candied, like pop rock sort of sweetness way, not that Jamaican Guyana like cola intensity sort of way. And I don't know if Australia is known for I guess a chiller rum compared to some of the Caribbean, or I mean, I've only had Beanley. I've never even had Bundaberg. So I don't even know.
Yeah, most Australians would probably say that's a good thing, but
Yeah.
Beanley, I think, is really when you think about. I mean, it was conceived of and is constructed and produced in a very like classic English style of production, right? That said, it does have its own distinct characteristic that makes it different than a lot of. That's why this is kind of why I struggle personally with the old framework of English, Spanish, French. I think it's a helpful framework for people getting into rum because it kind of like it cues you into why production methods are varied, which is very specifically tied to colonial history and to the tech that people were exposed to and how they're making their rums. But like Australia's just, I mean, Beanley rather has kind of its own thing going on. There's a lot of other Australian rum that's contemporarily being produced. There's a distillery outside of Melbourne called Killick that their whole rig is set up to emulate Jamaican style rum, and it is one of the funkiest, most like insane head scratcher kind of rums I've ever had. So I couldn't say that like broad stroke there's like an Australian style, but by virtue of like production and history, like Beanley is really, really important. And like their distillate, even though like the yeast strain from 07 to 2010 was different, and I've had some of that, like as much as it varies a bit, like there is a stylistic through line. And I think that it's just sometimes you kind of have to accept distilleries on their own terms, right? Like they may deviate, they may change, but in general, you can kind of find the components that make them what they are.
So this is column distilled.
Beanley is, I think, is pot and column, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken.
So like
It may,
a bourbon setup.
yeah, it may be on the bottle because Justin is sort of
Says here, it's tropical matured in American oak from the column, and then copper pot distillation process that follows. So,
Oh, okay. Interesting. We'll have to go and see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, good excuse.
I'll just be there via live stream as Holly is visiting, but it's all good. All right, so we're going to move on to some Barbados juice here.
Cool.
We've got the 10.5 and the 9.5. I say we start with the 10.5,
Cool.
and then we'll move on to the PX to wrap up. But so this one, so I didn't mention the last one was 430 bottles. This one is a lot smaller, 164 bottles. This is 52%. I'll just read the side here because I know you don't have all the bottles. It says pot and column still blend of Foursquare from Barbados, tropically aged in Barbados for 8 years in a bourbon cask. Then Australia dry aged in Adelaide for a 60-year-old Sepulchrefield French oak tawny port first fill cask for 8 months. That's a handful of a word to say there. Transferred to a level 3 char American oak ex Maker's Mark first fill cask to mellow for 22 months. Wow. I mean, talk about process. And even on the front of the bottle, it's got it all spelled out, how many years and months and all of these different things. Pretty amazing story behind this one, I have to say.
Definitely. This is where, we're all sort of benefited by the fact that Justin is a much more sort of like contemporary rum nerd and is very information driven. And I think by virtue of having been an importer and been sort of his own self-made student, was fascinated by all of these things. And so he, elects to share this. But Sepulchrefield is a really important tawny producer within Australia. I think that at this point, if you are even 100 years old, you can have like your birth year tawny at the winery. And so they have like a pretty illustrious, long-standing program. And so he's fortunate. This is part of the reason I think that Justin is really cool as an independent bottler, is that a lot of the,
Wow.
Let me back up. I don't mean this in a bad way, but a lot of like upstart IBs necessarily have to buy and bottle, right? They got to create a business. What's really cool about Justin is he's put a lot on the line in terms of like that buying and bottling phase. He got in and out really, really quick, and started to really put his own footprint on the product that he's putting out in the world. And one of the things that I think he does very well is he kind of keeps an eye towards his locale and sort of making use and finding specific utility with his neck of the world. So you see a lot, he's got a good relationship with the guys over in Fiji, but obviously in terms of like sourcing casks and like secondary vessels, he does a good job of sourcing even within Australia. And I just find that to be a really cool, there's a cool slant, right? Like if you are the Australian IB, like to make use of what you have going on, and to provide that as an experience to everyone else, I think that's compelling. It's a story that I want to hear and I also want to share.
This is incredibly crushable.
Oh yeah, that one's dangerous.
It's really scary how easy this one drinks. So when we're talking about the process on this one, so Foursquare, 8 years, then he gets it an Australian dry aged. Does that just mean on continental?
No, so I think I touched on this before, but it is no, it's okay. I've said so many things that you cannot keep track of what's coming out of my mouth at this point.
You said continental aged on the last bottle, so that's why.
Yes. So Justin's very good about being sort of honorific about a lot of contemporary rum conversation, but he, as far as dry aging, and specifically Australia dry aging, this is actually a term that he has coined. Okay. Because he's in Adelaide, where it has a super low humidity point, right? Like almost no humidity. Okay. And they have very punishing hot, dry summers. And so this creates a different relationship in terms of the barrel aging. Right. So
that's where it's in the tawny. It's in the
correct.
Got it. So 60 8 months in the tawny and then 22 months in the bourbon. So the bourbon cask as well as dry aged or in Adelaide.
Yes. So, for most of the rum world, right, there's kind of the dichotomy of tropical aged or continentally aged, or there is this sort of harmony between the two. And then what's interesting about Justin, what he brings to the table is that there's the third option, right? And there's the tertiary kind of aging process, which he's deemed Australian dry aging, because no one else does this. No one else is going to have this turn of phrase. It's not exactly popular. But the way that you have an alcohol spike in terms of like actually your content loss and the rate at which you're losing water as opposed to alcohol, it varies from both tropical and continental aging.
Holly says we just sold our last one. I'm sure we can get more.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, this is delicious. Yeah, just let us know if you want one of these, because we'll definitely bring in some more of this. This is really scary, actually. And the dry age term is really interesting. I don't know. It's good luck with that. I hope it catches. I understand it. I get it. It's just I think you're gonna find some people that are gonna be wondering what that is.
Isn't that used in beef?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. Hence the vegetarians not sure if it's used but it is a whiskey term of the staves for American whiskey in a little bit, isn't it? Or I guess that's seasoned or
Definitely not dry aged.
yeah.
It's all gustatory kind of, these are things
Very
we're
Australian.
tasting.
Yeah.
But yeah, Australian dry age is definitely, I mean, that is Justin's. But as much as that,
hey, kudos. I mean, we'll good for him to put out there, something that makes his whiskey maturation unique with a coin term. I mean, I like it. I think this is delicious. So whatever they say, they can go F themselves,
I think Warren, was this the one that you went with when you tasted them? Or was it the PX?
Yes, I believe so. And it has been delicious. It's easily become one of my favorite rums. Love the complexity. Very easy sipping, but there's also a lot to explore with it. So yeah, I'm very fond of it.
Nice.
Yeah, I couldn't remember which one you went with because we've been using the original little samples, Chris, that you had given us. And yeah, the Tawny Port has side by side has not beat out, but has just barely beat the PX.
I know, and that was something that I did not expect at all coming into it. Like the PX was actually much more austere, and took on some of those like drier, more astringent characteristics, rather than that kind of like bleeding Pedro Jimenez that a lot of people I think go into it. Like, in that said, that's it's one of these things where kind of like the A series where like it's going to be polarizing. People are going to like what they're going to like. If I had to lean one way or the other, I'm going Tawny. But
interesting how sweet on sweet can work, right? I mean,
yeah,
you don't necessarily expect that to be a winner. I mean, from what we've understood in whiskey, too much sweet, you're hiding something, right? You're trying to cover up something. So that's definitely not the case with this one. It's coming through beautifully. A lot of
definitely.
fun.
I think it's also really fun at just sort of a tasting level to do them side by side, right? Where you see what you kind of see the through line, you see where the distillate kind of showcases itself, and then you see the effect of the secondary maturation.
So this one's interesting. So this last one, we're going to move on to the PX. So this is pot and column still blend of Foursquare from Barbados, tropically aged in Barbados for 8 years in a bourbon cask. So just like the previous one. Australian dry aged in Adelaide in a Pedro Rodriguez PX Spanish 40-year-old cask for 8 months, and then transferred to a level 3 char American oak ex Maker's Mark first fill cask to mellow for a year. So a little younger, but just as complex in terms of process. 8 months in the PX, whereas the Tawny was what, 8 months as well. So they were both 8 months in this second cask, and then a little bit less time in the Maker's Mark for this one. But this one's also 52%. This one is 169 bottles. So also a small amount left. And I'm guessing that's because of all the transfer and the angel share and everything that you're only getting that certain number of bottles left.
Yeah, and on occasion at this point, like it's we'll split casks with the European market. So Justin is so young as a company that if we are afforded the luxury to do an exclusive for the US, I'll love it and I will champion it. But right now, we're basically he's done only sort of domestic releases until very recently. So he started exporting to the US with me, I think just right before he started exporting to Europe as well.
Oh, wow. So quite a different experience with this one.
Yeah.
You're getting much more of the brighter, fresh fruit, berry, strawberry, whatever sugar sweetness from the PX on this one. Not the dried fruit that you're getting with the Tawny. Even though, I mean, there are some prune kind of notes to it, but definitely not the more, I don't know, I got with that port one, I definitely got a lot more of the drier fruit notes with it, but really, really beautiful.
Definitely. The sort of like pruny element is a bit more reserved, but there is that kind of like astringence on the finish, which is the thing that kind of broke my brain when I first started tasting these two. Because that Tawny is just so fleshy and just so giving. Whereas there's a lot of fruit on this, but then as I mentioned before, the finish is immediately sort of a little bit more reserved at first. But then with time in the glass, upon revisiting, and then all of a sudden I think it kind of reveals its other characteristics.
It seems more viscous too. I don't know, it's definitely, for me at least, it's a little bit more mouth coating. Oily notes. Banana, there you go. There's a little tropical in this as well.
Oh, forgive me, I've been derelict in the whole chat. I like have to go back and reread here.
No, don't read it, because then you're gonna read all about yourself and you're gonna be like, what happened here? So no, I'm just kidding.
That'll be the time where the internet cut off.
Charles,
Like,
he's
fucking
gonna like
finally
viciously scroll through.
No, I won't. Really.
No, it's good tasting notes.
I'm curious, from the group that's with us right now, between the PX and the Tawny, which are your preferences? Just curious, I know we all have our different flavor profiles, but I'm just Tawny. Chad says Tawny. Warren just snatched a bottle, so I don't know if that means he likes the PX more or not. Tawny, all in on the PX. All right, so we got a little bit of an even battle here. PX for Holly. Well, if Holly says PX, we're screwed. So
It does have that
say Tawny at this point, you're not
Tawny's wrong.
you're not
No,
part
I'm
of
just
the group
kidding.
anymore.
Tawny is sold out.
Tawny's wrong.
It really does have that banana chocolate ice cream sort of, but like a dark chocolate finish, that drier. Yeah, I like it.
Darn it, I as much as I love Foursquare, I hate Foursquare because Foursquare is always this gravitational pull of, likes or whatever. And yeah, there we go. Holly said Australia. I mean, we need more like non-Barbados. I mean, we do have a bit here in the shop, but still Foursquare is that like easy sipping, sweet, delicious rum that people get to know. And
It's the Weller of rum,
yeah, which isn't a
which is a
bad.
compliment, but also
Exactly. It's both ways.
plating. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's definitely a very good product, and I think that this is where I'm a little bit spoiled just by virtue of like my exposure to a lot of these distillates, is that I don't really give a fuck about like ODBs that much, right? Because I'm very, very in on IB propaganda, and like to try Foursquare through independent bottling, it makes me come to the rest of the Foursquare lineup with greater appreciation for what they do.
Yeah.
But I find that independent bottling with whiskey, with rum, what have you, it really is like that's where you kind of get to see this unadulterated, very naked, stripped down version of someone's distillate, because it's not through their lens, right? It's through someone else's. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. So I think in this, with this back to back, like Justin really honors and showcases what is wonderful about Foursquare. And I've had the opportunity to do that through Samaroli as well. Like, they've bottled so many Foursquares in the past; they're delightful. But anytime a distillery is able to produce distillate that is like so compelling and so dynamic that like one bottling to the next is just a starkly different experience, is typically emblematic of like, hey, they're doing something that's like really pure and honest, and they're putting out good liquid.
But I mean, I've had a lot of Foursquare that's just like using other barrel types or blends of, I mean, yes, I can understand from a blending standpoint that there can be all sorts of different flavors, or a finishing standpoint. But are their core releases that different from each other? You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't know because I don't own the core range of Foursquare, and we can't actually carry that in our shop because it's a blend. But I'm asking from a layman's perspective right now. Are the different Foursquare releases that really different from each other, like different journeys? I know their blends, and I've had some of their blends. They're amazing, but I just don't know if that's their regular kind of release stuff.
I think that kind of is that's sort of the paradoxical nature of being a distillery and advocating and selling your own product, right? Where, if you don't find tremendous difference and variation between their own bottlings, I don't know necessarily that they're not capable of it, but rather they, as the producer, not just of the actual distillate, right? If you separate the distillery and what they make from the brand that they put out into the world, the brand that they put out into the world and the consumer facing product is one that, they have a vested interest in maintaining continuity and maintaining sort of the delight and the raptures of their devotees. But for independent bottlers, they get to break all of that, and they get to just say, like, yeah, and a lot of times too, if you think about the casks that are sold, and this applies with whiskey as well, where a lot of the casks that are sold in the secondary market are the casks that someone whose responsibility it is to blend all these things is saying to themselves, this is like this may not work. Like,
well, let me ask you this question. Is Foursquare as popular as it is because of independent bottlers or outside blenders, or because of themselves as a brand, of what they put out there to the world?
That's a very good question. I think, independent bottlers are always, like, historically are these wonderful marketers for distilleries, and that's what always like saddens me about distilleries choosing to not work with the broker market and not work with independent bottlers, because those are really the first people out that you don't pay for. You don't pay for that marketing. They're talking about what you do and all the rest. But I think that one would be foolish to overlook the considered effort that Richard Seal has made in terms of advocating for rum as a category, but then also for what he does specifically at Foursquare. So it's a little bit of both, but it's not to be overlooked, like how much investment he's probably put into the game.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's a fun world that we're just getting to know. And as whiskey drinkers, it's like the next step of flavor profile that makes the most sense to us. So it's really great to just kind of peel back the little layers that we've done so far.
And I love that you've got it's very akin to the Silvano Samaroli journey, right?
Yeah,
the foundation is within whiskey, and then there's this other frontier that's very sexy and intriguing.
Yeah, and again, like Holly mentioned earlier, we're not experts by any means in rum, and it's something we would like to learn more about. So we're very appreciative of new bottlers and brands and imports and all of that. So this was awesome. Anybody
just
have
like
any
with whiskey, you have to keep with rum, we have to keep drinking it to really learn. So everyone's forced in with us.
It's interesting for us being a shop that can currently only carry single cask products outside of whiskey. We're really limited to a very small section.
IBs.
It is IBs, but not all IBs are single cask either. So, we're really kind of it's even more narrow than we'd like it to be. But it's also just opened our eyes to a whole new world of flavor profile that we never even expected could even be possible. I mean, some of the rums that we've tried from South America and from even Thailand, I mean, of all places where they say the rum is the worst thing in the world, and it's wild. I mean, it's a totally wild ride, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a huge world that we want to learn more about. So,
big time. I did one of my. Sorry to plug myself and be excited about my own bullshit, but the first distillery that I'm going to work with is from Sicily, and I just visited them last month. And they are producing like an agricole style, like sort of French style historically, an agricole style rum in Sicily, but they're growing their own cane. They've got monovarietal bottlings. It's really, really fascinating to see how excited the general world is, not just at the consumer level, but at the production level as well, and how the world continues to expand. And it's a totally different slant on everything, and it's fascinating. I'll send you samples. I need to do that. Just because you can't sell it doesn't mean you can't taste it. And I'm really, really excited to share it with everyone. So
that's cool. Yeah, no, we're excited. I mean,
and before Chris leaves too, we need to know where his importing company name comes from.
Yeah, Spaghetti Western.
Oh, well, that's from the annals of my bizarre brain, but then also just to honor the funny history that I have with Samaroli.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, yeah, it's like there are two things that kind of are happening in the 60s that I think are the coolest for Italy, if I completely remove like fashion and all the rest and design, and that's like film and whiskey. So the spaghetti westerns and that whole exploration is born in that same time. And when I was trying to think of a name, that one was just the perfect amount of absurdity. And I figured it would be just like dumb enough, but perfect enough that it would suit me. So it's been a fun ride in terms of no one, or rather everyone second guesses the spelling of spaghetti, which I love. But I think it's a good sort of device to keep remembering. And yeah, so I mentioned Tarantino, like big Tarantino fan growing up. That's like kind of why I became interested in spaghetti westerns independently. So alas, that's what it was.
The Wild Bunch. That's where.
Yeah, and when I told Antonio Bleve that that's what I was thinking. Cazzo, spaghetti western, che bello. So I was like, that's all the cosign I need.
That's my favorite one, though. Is the Wild Bunch. I love that one. So, all right, we're gonna wrap up. I know we're taking away from his lobster roll time, so we're going to let Chris get back to his mom and to the wonderful Maine vacation mode that he's in, which we're all jealous for, because I want to do that too. But
Thank you. I'm happy to share it with everyone. By the way, also small plug, if anyone does happen to buy a bottle to show support and show some love, Samaroli has their own specially designed.
I was reading about that earlier today. The Samaroli glass. So what the heck is that all about?
So this is one of the this weirdo company that I love so much. They have gone through the trouble over many years to continue designing and redesigning this glass. And so this is the latest iteration, which I quite like. And for now, unlike everything else in the Samaroli world, it is free. So please let me pass on that good juju while it's free, because I'm sure the day will arrive in which it is not.
That I read was that their whole thing was that you didn't want to concentrate the vapors or the into the nose. Like you didn't want it to be angled like a Glencairn. Like, I mean, this is like typical for your nose. It all accentuates towards the top. But that one's tilted as well. That one also has a.
So this is probably the third. No, I think this is the third or the fourth iteration of it. So it used to be very stout, almost no stem. Then it elongated for like elegance purposes. Like, this feels appropriate and Italian. But yeah, there's the little stopper, the little base here, and then you have the opportunity basically to have alcohol on a broader surface, which if you think about like wine glasses and like bigger wine glasses that are intended to open up out like higher alcohol wines, that's the intent here. And then unlike in the past where it was actually much more just like straight up from here, this is kind of a compromise where you're having a little bit more of the concentration of the alcohol vapors. So she's pretty, she's free. And
how is that possible? How is it anything free anymore?
Don't ask questions. That's one of the lessons I've learned. While it's free, just get it while it's good.
Well, how does that happen?
The next time we send anything to the shop, I'll just throw a couple of those on, and it goes on
line tonight. Then we'll make sure it happens. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. Really, really, really appreciate you coming online with us tonight. And
yeah, thanks, Chris.
We're really excited about what you're doing and what you're bringing into the U.S. as well. And we'll be as big supporters as we can here in Saratoga Springs. So from a Saratoga Whiskey Club standpoint, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And cheers, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you all very soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for supporting small businesses like First Fill and Spaghetti Western. Continue to do that. Always look at import statements. There are a lot of big muckers in this world, but you got to root for the little guy.
That's right. Little guy always comes out eventually. All right. See you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.